Thanks for tuning in. Join me today as I go through the repair, restoration, and testing of my Marantz 2500. This 2500 was not shown much respect for a long time. This 2500 had several issues that didn't just happen at one time. These were issues that happened over a period of years. If you enjoy vintage audio equipment, you've come to the right spot. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell, as well as giving me a big thumbs up if you like this video, and share it with others. There is a risk of serious injury or death from electrical shock working on this equipment. If you're not comfortable with working on the equipment, please do not take the cover off and consult a professional. First, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the Marantz 2500 receiver. It was produced from 1977 to 1980. It was rated at 250 watts per channel into 8 ohms and a massive 330 watts per channel into 4 ohms. The 2500 features AM, FM stereo, 2 phono inputs, 2 tape monitors, as well as an auxiliary input. The tone controls in the Marantz 2500 are full-featured. It features a bass, a mid-range, and a treble control, as well as several turnover frequencies that are used in conjunction with those controls. The most unusual feature in the Model 2500 is the oscilloscope display. The Marantz 2500 has no tuning meters for your radio broadcasts. So you use the oscilloscope for both to give you an indication of the signal strength and an exact center channel tuning, just like meters do. The oscilloscope also indicates the multipath reception, which really helps out when you're moving your antenna around. Instead of guessing, well, do I have it in the right spot or not? Pretty much in a nutshell, if the display, when you have the multipath selected, if the display is straight, a horizontal line straight across, you're good to go. If you get like a jagged line, the more jagged it is, the more you're off. So you can move your antenna and get your radio reception more perfect. It can also show stereo separation and phase relationships. I just wanted to share some of the features of the Marantz 2500, and now I'll show you the repair and restoration of my 2500. I obtained this 2500 from a gentleman who picked it up at an estate sale. As you guys know, I'm a hobbyist and I'm interested in the history of the units, and he isn't. So he just bought it. He really didn't know anything about it, where it came from, whose it was, or anything. But I purchased it from him. And you'll see here in the video that there were many different issues. Obviously, this unit, one thing broke, maybe 30 years ago, then another thing broke 25 years ago, and another thing broke 20 years ago, and then finally it probably got to the point where it was unusable and it was just stored away somewhere. And I'll show you what the unit looked like when it started, and I'll show you at the end what the unit looks like now. A lot of different issues made this unit a challenge to repair. The balance control knob on this 2500 is missing, but the shaft is still there. That'll make finding a replacement knob easier. I ended up using the balance control knob from a Marantz 2265. It looks fine, and the knob fit the shaft correctly. The oscilloscope vertical centering knob has lost its little chrome cover. I'll have to just find a solution for that. From right to left, it shows here a what was left of the original oscilloscope vertical center knob, the knob I used to make the new knob, then the completed knob. I removed the plastic from the replacement knob, which made the knob more closely match the 2500's original chrome knob. The new knob was slightly larger than the other scope's knob, so I just moved the level control to the vertical position. I then installed the newly created knob on the scope's level control shaft. This just made the 2500 look more complete. You know, the level knob is slightly larger than the other two, but this 2500 looks so much better now. You wouldn't know it if you didn't know it. This 2500 came with a wood cabinet. That's a little beat up, but I think I can get it cleaned up a little bit anyway. Now I'm showing the 2500 after I removed it from the wood chassis. It's just time to take a good visual look at what I've got. I removed the top cover. It's always a good idea, just take a casual look, you know, whenever you're dealing with equipment you're not familiar with. And again, I removed the bottom cover to make sure there wasn't any unpleasant surprises after I powered up the 2500 for the first time. The first thing I see from the top is that the soft start relay is missing its plastic cover. In addition, that relay is loose in its housing. You know, these covers don't just fall off relays. So this 2500 had been worked on at some point and probably abandoned. There's a lot of dirt in the relay where the plastic case would normally protect it, so this is probably many years ago when this was worked on. There's no case on the relay, so there is no identification number. The service manual, along with the pin configuration, should help me figure out what relay to replace it with. Just to the left of the relay, there's a power resistor. The red wire, you can see, is stuck to the power resistor. You know, power resistors get very hot. The insulation from the wire just melted to the resistor. You can almost bet, you know, this wasn't how it was, obviously, when it left the factory 40 years ago. You know, this is the only 2500 I've worked on, but it would not leave the factory. You know, either it was restrained with a tie wrap or it was routed different, something, but they're not going to run wires right up against a power resistor so the insulation can melt. The faceplate, it's going to have to come off. I mean, there's always a ton of dirt and plenty to clean, and really the only way to do that is to, you know, remove the faceplate so you can get to it. And you know, a lot of time will be spent with water, rags, cleaners, you know, etc. to remove the years of grime. It's found its way even into protected areas like, you know, the radio dial. Dirt gets in one way or another. I've removed the faceplate, and now I can get behind the faceplate and just clean up a ton of crud that's been there, that gets in these things after 40 years. Many times they're just put aside and starts collecting dirt just like any other item would. The faceplates are pretty messy, but the good thing is the stenciling, it's pretty much intact. There's not a lot of damage to the faceplate. With some time and patience, I think most of these stains are gonna end up coming off. When you have the faceplate off, it's always a good idea to, if you're not going to work on it right away, put it in some bubble wrap, put it aside so you don't kick it over, so the soldering iron don't hit it, something. Just a good idea to move it. After I powered up the 2500 for the first time, I noticed that none of the function indicator LEDs were working. PIC FM, AM, you know, phono, nothing. It was dead. That little indicator board needs 8 volts AC to operate. I didn't have any voltage to the board, so there's a good reason why it wasn't working. I found a broken wire that jumpers the 8 volts AC from the dial lamp board to the function indicator via, you know, like I say, just via a wire. So I just jumpered it, and I figured, well, that should do it. Well, I had 8 volts, still didn't work. So anyway, after troubleshooting, I found a shorted diode on the indicator board, and after fixing the wire and putting in a new diode, gee, we had, you know, the function board worked. But this is how these things are. And anything that's 40 years old, don't care if it's an old car, an old piece of stereo equipment, you're probably going to have multiple problems. Now I'm going to start removing boards in the 2500 for further repair and restoration. You know, always take pictures before you start removing the connectors. You know, taking pictures allows you to get the unit back together correctly. Some connectors are keyed, some are not. You know, serious damage can occur if you install a cable incorrectly. Remember, this is not trauma surgery. So I mean, just take your time. There's no hurries. Do it in a method that works for you. Here I've removed the tone amp board for servicing. You know, obviously having the board out of the chassis makes component replacement much easier. And also, you know, having the board in your hand makes cleaning the pots much easier. The cleaning of the pots is a must when you're doing any type of vintage restoration. I use Deoxit D5. It's a spray, but there's several other chemicals out there that'll work just as good. Taking this thing apart is really not that difficult, but keep the screws, the washers, etc. in a way that makes sense to you. Me, you know, I kind of line them up. I kind of think ahead, where does this go back? And I don't get too far ahead of myself, so I'm not, you know, at the end thinking, where does all this stuff go? The push button switches in the 2500, they also need to be cleaned. Again, this is the cause of many intermittent issues that you have with vintage stereo equipment. Any board that has plug-in pins, like the 2500 does have some boards like this. I use a Deoxit D100, which is a liquid deoxit, and a Q-tip. Put a little bit on the Q-tip and wipe the pins. It's a lot better choice for this type of cleaning. And when you have any assembly out of the 2500, you know, it's a good time to just take a look at the solder points to make sure everything's okay. I mean, you're going to be bending wires back and forth, and like any wires, they're 40 years old and you only get so many bends in them. Once you've serviced a section, always a good idea, put it back together and try it before moving on. You spend hours working on something and then you try it and it doesn't work. A heck of a lot easier to go back and fix one thing that you've been working on than saying, well, I've worked on 4 or 5 assemblies. Jeez, where's the problem? So it's always better to work on one assembly, maybe 2, get it back together, just give it a quick check to make sure there's not a problem before you move on. You know, usually I wait until the end of vintage equipment repair or restoration before I clean the faceplate. This time I'm going to do it kind of more toward the beginning or no further than the middle. You know, there's no one order that's correct. Just do it in the order that's right for you. And right now I'm going to go ahead and clean the faceplate and the knobs. I feel the best approach cleaning this 2500 faceplate is to just use warm water and a little bit of dish soap first. Something mild. You don't want to go and use some chemical if you don't need to, so you just use something mild and just see how it goes. I mean, get as much of the grime as you can before you use something more powerful is the thing. I mean, there's just less of a chance to damage the faceplate. Now, I've used Mother's mag polish successfully on many aluminum faceplates. First clean it, you know, do the water thing, get as much as you can, and that mag polish will get down in those little spots in that aluminum faceplate and really clean it up quite well. But I've never had an issue, but that doesn't mean you're not going to. And this is certainly much more abrasive than warm water and dish soap. So you really should test a small area, you know, to make sure you don't have some type of an issue before you go for it. You can use soft rags, paper towels, Q-tips, a toothbrush, and it's gonna take some time. I'm done with cleaning up the faceplate. I'm gonna start moving on to some more component changing, and I'm going to go ahead and do the audio muting board. A new Marantz speaker relay will be installed. I mean, it's always, again, the original relay is 40 years old. Does it still work? Yeah. How long is it going to work? I don't know. Maybe another 40, or maybe another 40 days. It's just silly to do a restoration and not change this relay, and they are still available. It should always be changed out. And then, speaking of parts, almost all the components needed to repair or to restore a Marantz 2500 is still available. I've put the new speaker relay in, some new electrolytic capacitors. They're high temperature and capacitors, 105 degrees centigrade rated. They're just a good thing to use in a piece of equipment like this that will get warm. Hopefully it doesn't get 105 degrees centigrade, but it gives you a little room in there of play, and hopefully this thing will go another 40 years with the new capacitors in it. You know, I'm going to go for the power supply board next. I mean, it's probably the most important board. in the unit. Something goes wrong on the power supply, could destroy the whole unit. And again, you can't take too many pictures. Just take a few minutes, take pictures. Certainly you don't want to be hooking something up wrong, or you're not sure what goes where. Click off hundreds of them and it doesn't matter. It doesn't cost you nothing. You can mark the cables too. The way I mark them, you'd probably be saying, well, what's he doing? It doesn't matter. Mark them in a way that makes sense to you. Write it down on a piece of paper. It doesn't matter. You know, it's just the idea is something that makes sense to you so you can get it back together correctly. I'm going to be changing out the regulators in the power supply. They've been in there 40 years. That's long enough. And they're being replaced with modern equivalents along with new insulators for the transistors. And along with that, you have to clean up the old thermal compound and add a thin layer of new. Again, there's a lot of information on the internet about how to apply it and what brand to use. Again, there's a lot of choices. So now I've installed the new MJE 15032 transistors, and I'm going to do the remaining components. Modern test equipment really helps you out with the old stuff. You know, back in the day, in 1977, they wouldn't have had a little thing that goes in the palm of your hand where you can test a diode to see what the heck it is. Or in this case, a Zener diode to see what the heck it is. And in this unit with an oscilloscope, it's very unusual in solid state equipment to have, if you see in the picture, I mean, there's 250 to 350 volt rated capacitors. But that's all for the oscilloscope, not for anything else in it. Pretty much got it. Everything changed out, and again, I've got this sitting on the table, so it makes it much, much easier to work on than you're trying to do stuff within the chassis. You know, like I mentioned before, it's a great time to look at the soldering side of it. You know, turn it over, look at the artwork side, and just see if you see anything. If it looks questionable, well, now's the time to hit it with an iron. Certainly not going to hurt you to do that. I'm going to mount the power supply back in to the 2500. Next, I'm going to hook the cables back up, of course, and again, during any vintage audio, you know, repair, restoration, it's best to check your work as you go, and certainly after working on the power supply and hooking it, putting it back, and make sure that it does power up fine so you can move on to the next task. The 2500 powered up fine after rebuilding the power supply. Now it's time to move on. Be working on changing out components and cleaning controls on the tone board and the filter amp board. Once again, you know, once some of these boards that come completely out like this, you can see how it just makes it so much easier to work on, whether it's changing components or cleaning the pots. The electrolytic capacitors are 40 years old. It's time for them to go. There is a requirement in some areas of this receiver to use audio grade capacitors. And so I'll use those where needed. And also I found that when I was working on this, and this is not unusual, the unit's 40 years old. Other folks have worked on it. And if you look at the connector in this picture, you can see it's soldered. Well, you know what happened there? A wire wrap where they used to, that was the way they did things back in the 70s. They used wire wrap guns, both in consumer equipment and commercial equipment, and those things, they're pretty fragile now, and you start moving them around, they break, and usually what you do, if those break, you just solder them onto the pin, so that's not unusual to see. And there are certain places where transistors should be gain matched. They were gain matched back in 1977, and 40 years later, they still need to be gain matched. I've started to remove the phono amp out of the 2500, and on the internet you'll see a lot of people, they either skip this board or they tear the entire unit to pieces, and this is just not necessary. Some patience is. You're going to have to cut many tie wraps and unhook many cables, and really it is a mess. If you look in here, the pictures don't do the mess justice. It does just look like an impossible gaggle of wires, but it really isn't. So again, what are we going to do? In whatever manner works for you, going to mark these cables, right? So you can get everything back together. Once you get everything unhooked, you know, I guess if you worked in the factory, you wouldn't have had to do this. But, you know, for most of us who don't work on them every day, just pictures and marking things, and more pictures and marking things. Well, one of the tricks I found to get the phono board out to be able to replace components on it was, believe it or not, to loosen up the dial lamp board way up at the top of the receiver. Just loosen it and move it back into the chassis. I didn't have to unhook everything. There's plenty of room to get in there, change capacitors, you know, clean the switches up, do what needs to be done. I use an Atlas DCA Pro to match the gain of these transistors. You know, you try to get two of them that are pretty close to the gain that you need. The phono board, once again, it was a combination on this board of NPW series and audio grade capacitors. You don't want to have to rip back into this thing. Hopefully this goes back together and it's not coming apart for a long time. So any of you folks out there that are looking at a 2500 that has been supposedly restored, probably the most important question you could ask, was the phono board restored? Because they're a little bit of a pain to do. You know, a lot of times people skip this over because this is going to take you some time to get this apart and back together. But now, moving on to the, I guess we'll move on to the filter amp board. And again, we got these push button switches, one electrolytic capacitor on this board, but it's 40 years old, just like the rest of them, so we change it out. But really on this board, you know, those push button switches will cause you a lot of intermittent problems. Then there's a little dubbing board. Not much to it, but again, it's out. May never be used, but it, you know, you clean it with a deoxit, you put it back in like you would any other of the components. I found in testing, I knew I had a problem initially. Phono, just big loud hum. Just think not hooking your ground up to your turntable. So I wasn't sure what that was all about. Then after rebuilding the power supply, I did a little bit of troubleshooting. Looking at the schematic, I was supposed to have 31 volts from the power supply, and I measured 39. So I knew that was too far off. Sometimes, you know, something's 31, if it's 29, if it's 33, but that was too far off. And again, using modern test equipment, I found there were two bad transistors. And probably one transistor went and took the other one out. Once I replaced the two defective transistors, I had 31 volts. And guess what? I had no hum. Hopefully, you know, at that point anyway, I knew I had a somewhat working phono section. The next board going to work on is the peak indicator and soft start board. Once again, transistors, diodes, capacitors. There are some diodes in the 2500 that have a history of failing. And you're in there and they should be replaced. Does it mean yours is going to fail? Who knows? But once again, you're doing all this work. I mean, and these diodes are 2 and 3 cents a piece. So I mean, it's just, you know, it's really silly not to throw a few pennies in and go ahead and change any of these diodes that have a history of failing. So, and that's what I did. Once again, modern test equipment, and then you can figure out whether you can get an equivalent diode to what's failed, or sometimes you have to combine a couple diodes to get what you want. Now I've got the soft start board back into the 2500, and of course, what do we do before moving on? We give it a try. The 2500, well, powered up fine, and now it's time to move on. We're going to move on to the main amp board now. I've removed the assembly that contains the power amp boards for both the left and the right channel. This assembly comes out pretty easy. Again, you got to take a bunch of cables and several screws from the bottom, and out she'll come. You know, when I got this out, there was just, you know, the fan was a mess. Like any fan. Think of your ceiling fan in your house. Somehow it collects all the dirt and grime even though it's spinning. And the fan in here was just covered, and everywhere around on the chassis that's around the fan was just covered in dirt. And that'll all have to be cleaned up. I'll now remove both the left and the right amp boards for component replacement. These come off quite easy. I mean, there's 6 screws, and it'll just pull right on off of the 3 plug-in connectors. Certainly, this is one of those boards in the 2500 that are much easier to work on than some of them are. With it removed, now I can replace those transistors, diodes, capacitors, you know, that I need to do. Now I've replaced the 40-year-old components on one of the amp boards. once again, you probably, hopefully, you won't have to get back in here for another 40 years, although there's no guarantee of that. So the 2500, it uses a heat sink tunnel and a fan to keep the outputs cool. I'll have to take that apart. Again, it's going to be filthy in there and needs to be cleaned up. You know, again, whenever you have a fan, it just has a way of collecting dirt everywhere. And I'm sure this 2500 hasn't been cleaned in 40 years. Why would it be? So one of the things that are a little more difficult in this unit, the output transistors are soldered in. A lot of times they're in sockets. You undo 2 screws, they pull right out. Well, not in this case. You must unsolder the base and the emitter of the output transistors from the power transistor connection board to remove them. I use a Hacko 808 desoldering tool that makes this job pretty easy. You know, it can heat up a large area and it sucks the solder right out for you. Now, if you don't have a tool like this, it can be a real pain to try to get those transistors out. But once the transistors are removed, the heatsink area needs to be cleaned up and new thermal compound applied. Again, a lot of cleaning involved with this Marantz 2500, but what do you expect after 40 years? This is what you'd have in any piece of equipment. I'll take each heatsink and take it to the sink and clean it with a toothbrush, just like new. They'll clean up. The heat sinks will look like they did when it left Japan in 1977. Of course, you're taking the power transistors out for a reason, and that's to clean them up and to put new insulators on them. There's just dirt and grime everywhere, including on the power transistors. I mean, these are the original ones that left, you know, again, Japan 40 years ago, and cleaning them will, you know, allow them to run cool, and cleaning that heatsink tunnel will allow them to run cool. And again, while we got them out, we're going to change out the insulators. Why put the old ones back in? Again, those things are just pennies a piece. You got it apart. Why wouldn't you do that? So I've started to clean up the first heatsink, and I'm going to reinstall the power transistors along with the new insulators and the thermal compound. I've got the first transistor back in. There's 15 more to go. There's 16 of them, so it's going to take a little bit of time. Also, the drivers that are mounted in this tunnel will be changed out. Once again, you're in there. Do you want to take this apart again in a year or even 10? No. I'm going to replace the drivers again with modern equivalents and also a new insulator there too, a new thermal paste. This is going to take a while. Don't expect to complete it in one evening. It's just not going to happen. But after 40 years, you know, it needs to be done. I've completed a half of the heatsink tunnel output transistor work. The left tunnel's complete. The right still needs to be done. Once again, same story. Just repeat what you just did. One, you know, you're going to have to go in there and just a lot of cleaning, new insulators, and new thermal paste. I've got them all cleaned up, both tunnels. I've, you know, the new insulators in, the heat sinks are cleaned up. I mean, this thing's ready to go again, hopefully for another 40 years. I've got the heat sink tunnel back together, and we're getting pretty close to reinstalling this. And while you're in there, I mean, you got this thing out, so you clean up the chassis around where that tunnel assembly sits. You know, why wouldn't you? And again, it's time to clean the fan up. The fan's a mess, this foam's got to come off. And actually what I found, I cleaned up the fan, I got it ready to be reinstalled, I reinstalled it. Man, was it loud. I mean, it was just much louder than it was 40 years ago. And again, what a surprise, right? A 40-year-old fan. What do you expect? So I replaced the fan with a new fan. Fortunately, you know, I got this thing all back together, and then the fan was still so noisy, I just couldn't live with it. Fortunately, the rear panel of the 2500 will tilt down, so I could get the old fan out without removing that whole tunnel that I just reinstalled. Sometimes, you know, sometimes you get lucky, and in this case I did. I had to change up the hardware a little bit on the fan, but besides that, went right in there fine, and wow, so much quieter, much closer to what it would have been as new. Get it all back together, and what do? fire it up, you know, and check our work and make sure it's working, and powered up fine. And now it's time to get toward the end here and set the bias and also, you know, the DC offset. And again, you should have the service manual. Service manual's got the procedure for this particular unit. So you need the Marantz 2500 service manual, and it'll walk you through how to set this stuff up. And of course you want to take one final eyeball. You know, we had a lot of stuff out of here. Make sure everything's tie wrapped back up. There's nothing that looks like it needs attention, because the next thing that's going to do here, we're going to be putting the cover back on this thing, and it's going to go to bench testing. You know, you take one final look to make sure everything's okay. And also, don't forget the back. You think that's ever been done in 40 years? Very unlikely. So you do that too. And so now I've reinstalled the faceplate and the knobs, and I've just done a basic test on the controls before bench testing. Push the buttons and make sure everything's working correctly. I mean, as far as to your ear anyway. Now, I've got to do something with that wood case that I took off way back when. It's a little beat up, but so's the 2500. The rest of it's a little beat up, but that's okay. You know, if you wanted to make it more perfect, and I've done this before, I've refinished the case. You know, you'd have to sand it down to make it look newer. But I don't know, in this case, that's what you want to do, and I'm not going to do it. It's okay for it to look a little beat up, because it is a little beat up. So, but with that being said, I used a couple of Howard wax products, Restore Finish and Feed and Wax, and it really did a good job. You know, I didn't have a lot of real deep scrapes in the wood, so the Restore Finish kind of filled that in pretty good, and the Feed and Wax, and it really looked pretty good. Is it perfect? No. But so neither is the rest of this 2500 cosmetically, but it kind of fits the way the rest of it looks. Now, it's time for a bench test. On the test bench, I'll use a Sound Technology 3200A audio analyzer. You know, this is a piece of vintage test equipment, just like the 2500's vintage. This is a piece of test equipment from the 1980s. But it does a very good job really testing any type of the amplifier related specifications. You know, the ones you see like at the back of your manual, it'll tell you something along the line of rated power output, continuous, per channel, both channels driven, what have you. You know, harmonic distortion. Many of the specifications that are in the manual, you can verify that with this piece of equipment. So whenever you rebuild a piece or just have it in for any reason, bench testing is very important, because it can pick up things your ears can't. So if you have a major difference between the left and right channel, whether you can hear it or not, there's something not right. So this just verifies that all the work that was done is good and valid, and you know, you feel good that you've tested it, you know, with your ears, but you've also tested it with equipment. You can input various frequencies, you can run it to different power levels, and the 3200A will, you know, give you the data and tell you what it's doing. You know, the distortion numbers were very good throughout the various frequencies. For both the left and the right channel, they're very close. You know, everything looked fine there. The two channels tracked very, very close together. Here I'm showing, you know, I mean, both channels were running 104 watts continuous into 8 ohms. They were dead even. The balance is very good. That all looked good. And so I think we're about going to wrap it up. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a big thumbs up down below for you non-subscribers. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please subscribe. And for my present subscribers, as I always say, thank you very much. You all have a good day.